I'm most familiar with Indonesia, where I've worked for a number of years, and of course that's the world's leading oil palm producer right now, and most of the oil palm is produced in forest areas, and so we have a big trade-off between actually deforesting rainforest, tropical rainforest, for either a cooking fuel or, if it does become competitive with diesel markets, into a biodiesel. And so this is another really interesting trade-off. It's an incredibly lucrative crop, actually, in Indonesia. And it can be grown easily, actually, on more degraded lands that have been used already for other purposes, and so without the need to actually deforest new lands. But there's all sorts of politics and economics behind this one, and a lot of companies are allied with timber companies that actually will deforest to get the land and get the timber revenues and then eventually produce the oil palm as well. So there's some really tricky questions with oil palm, but it is a viable source, and particularly I think in Asian markets, a lot of this oil palm right now is going as cooking fuel in China and India. But if it does become competitive with regular diesel fuel, I think that it really could take off, and the repercussions for land use are going to be enormous and globally very significant. And so actually, if you're cutting down a forest, particularly on peat soils, then of course you're getting much more carbon emitted than you would be saving carbon by using biodiesel relative to regular diesel. And so the life cycle analysis looks terrible if you're actually deforesting, and particularly on peat soils. But if you're using other soils or lands that have already been converted, and this would be just a new use of land on lands that have been converted, it can be much more favorable. So there's just a huge range of estimates on the oil palm and biodiesel side of things. Well, in the poorest countries of the world, agriculture may already constitute 25-35% of GDP and employ maybe 50, 60, 70% of the labor force. So it's not an instantaneous transition you're going to have by any means. And the human resources and the institutions to make this work become just really, really difficult. It's easy to sit at Stanford and drop a little model of how this would work, but when you get on the ground, and most of the people in these poor rural areas have no education and no means to actually connect, and there's no roads to connect them and so forth, it's not as easy as just let's build a city and solve the problems. China, you've seen that to some extent, and so if you have a system like China and you can replicate it with very heavy-handed government, huge amounts of resources and so forth, maybe you can get there, but it's at a huge cost, obviously, to how families operate, how the environment actually survives in this circumstance, and so there's not a real silver bullet there, I wouldn't say, and yet some incentives to move people out of agriculture in some of these places is going to be important. There's no question about it. We're the largest ethanol producer in the world. We're really driving this alternative use of energy, mainly through more conventional corn-based ethanol. And I think we really need to think hard about what the trade-offs are in terms of land use and food prices. But politically, how much are we willing to pay for it? Do we really want to keep subsidizing something that is having some social costs, having benefits, but probably could work fine on its own without those subsidies? And so I think the main message that I'd like to leave off with is I think the U.S. really has to think carefully about its subsidies in this particular area, maybe devote that kind of resources to other forms of alternative energy and let ethanol take its normal course.